This is our discussion of successionally developed agroecosystems for the agroecology class. We're going to be basing these systems on nature, so we need to look at ecological concepts like disturbance, recovery or succession, and resilience. And we also want to look at how to develop mature components of agroecosystems, not just trees, but also perennial grains, perennial forages for animals, and livestock grazing. We're going to be looking beyond annual cropping. So we'll start with disturbance. Systems undergo disturbance all the time. Whether it's a natural ecosystem, they're affected by windfall, hurricanes. Y'all might have lived through some hurricanes closer to the coast. Drought, fire. Our agroecosystems, they also undergo extreme disturbances in terms of plowing, cultivation or weeding, pruning, grazing, harvest. We have to harvest to be able to use the edible biomass. So succession is recovery from these disturbances, and it's a directional type of development that helps the ecosystem return to the same type of structure and functioning that it had before. Disturbance in industrial ag is widespread, intense, and frequent. We've talked a lot this semester about the example of tillage, that tillage is an intense type of disturbance. And what it does is it keeps systems in an early stage of succession. There happens to be high productivity in this early stage, and that's what industrial ag depends on, the high productivity of annual cropping. But the problem is that high inputs are also required, meaning seed, irrigation, fertilizer, pesticides. High external inputs are needed, and it also degrades the system over time. So we want to move away from only annual cropping and from intensive disturbance. And we'll look at this from an ecological point of view first. And we'll look at it as recovery from disturbance. And so this takes us through early to late successional stages. We'll look at it in terms of the ecosystem functions that we're already familiar with, for example, nutrient cycling, energy flow. So if we look first at interactions and diversity that's needed for these interactions, there is, after a disturbance like plowing, there's going to be low diversity, of course, at first. And it's the weedy annual plants, the pioneers, that come in. And this might be the weeds that you see in the garden all the time, different types of cress, purslane around here. You see weedy annuals. And the interactions that take place at first are going to be mainly competition type interactions. Nutrient cycling, nutrient availability tends to be high, especially after a fire, for example, but retention is poor at first. Energy flow, early on, there's low biomass, and that's why we have high productivity and a high harvest potential at first, because we have high net primary productivity. I've written this out here as a footnote at the bottom to remind you that the net primary productivity is high early on because gross photosynthesis actually exceeds respiration. And so that's why there can be a lot of edible biomass in harvest at the beginning. But as we look, as the arrows proceed here through successional stages, the diversity of species will increase over time, the abundance and types of species, and perennials will actually replace many of these annual pioneers. So we'll start to see plants that are more perennial and can provide more mutualisms instead of competition. In terms of nutrient cycling, we do see more nutrient conservation in later stages. Energy becomes used more for maintenance instead of respiration. So this does actually reduce our productivity. But keep in mind, it maintains a high standing biomass. And I've footnoted this too to remind you that the high-standing biomass, that does require more energy for maintenance, for respiration. So our net primary productivity goes down. But the biomass, what that is, it's ultimately our soil organic matter. Because we're not harvesting everything. We're leaving some of the biomass in the system, and we're going to feed the soil. So that's an important part of fertility. As we move along the successional process, eventually we do reach equilibrium in the system. And it's going to be that the system is in equilibrium with its local conditions and with the regional climate, and the system has returned to the basic structure and function that it had before. The same level of complexity, and hopefully it's much more resilient than in the early stages. And again, we do give up some of the productivity, but the trade-off is we have a robust, complex, resilient system that can withstand damage and disturbance. You can actually introduce some levels of disturbance into established mature ecosystems, and this is the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, that if the disturbance is not too frequent, widespread, or intense, you can maintain both productivity and diversity in your system. So this is a very useful concept for agroecosystems where we do need to disturb the systems. We need to harvest, for example. We often need to prune, we need to graze. So it's a very interesting system to keep in mind that if you look across, and this is looking at natural systems, the frequency, scale, and intensity of disturbances. In nature, it may be a high frequency, such as natural windfall of trees in the forest. This takes place often, but the scale is small and the intensity is low. Hurricane damage, on the other hand, does tend to be a very large scale, widespread, and very intense disturbance, but it doesn't happen frequently. The biomass removal of herbivores in grasslands by grazing, this takes place frequency, the scale is a medium scale, its intensity is low. So using intermediate disturbance is a way to maintain the agroecosystem. This table from the book will help us look at desirable characteristics of agroecosystems during the successional stages of early, mid, to late. So we can look at characteristics that you're familiar with, like over time we're going to see high species diversity. These are desirable characteristics. We're going to see this late in the successional stage. Nutrient cycling, we've already discussed that there might be a lot of nutrients available at first, but really retention and conservation of nutrients, that comes later in the system. The only thing that really takes place early on is the high net primary productivity. So this is a desirable feature of agroecosystems, so we need to figure out ways to include that. You know, not everything is going to be late stage. But using our processes of ecosystems that we've talked about all semester, efficient nutrient cycling, effective solar capture, that's what's going to get us the high net primary productivity and also the high total biomass, which is our soil organic matter, and that comes later in the system. The mutualistic interactions, these are also going to be more prevalent later in the system, and the benefit of that is that we don't need as many external inputs. As we think about what we need for sustainable agroecosystem design, we need to design with these benefits of early stage net primary productivity. And that usually does include some annual cropping. But we also need to design, we need to use natural succession for the more mature stages. So how do we do that? Here's an example from the textbook of building a successionally developed agroecosystem with trees. And this is just one example of what you can do to actually manage succession. You can start with annual cropping, but we're going to move beyond that. So you do, of course, have, let's just talk about bare ground, after a major disturbance. And so you can put in some fast-growing pioneer type species of annual crops, but soon you do need to add other crops, and this is part of the intercropping that we've talked about. You do need to put in nitrogen fixers, for example, plants with different root depths. So it might be that you have broccoli and lettuce, for example. Broccoli has a shallow root depth, but lettuce has a shallow root depth, but broccoli has a much deeper root depth. And trees, of course, are going to have much deeper roots. So some of these may be nitrogen fixers. You do, by the third or fourth season, want to add in actually some biennials. They might be, they may not be trees, but they could be, cassava is an example in the tropics of a root crop that usually lasts about 2 years. In temperate areas, we might talk more about something like blueberries. But, you start intercropping also with at least biennial species. And then you do add in your perennials. And here's a small tree added in. This is by the fifth growing cycle. This is how you add in trees. They're, of course, going to be small at first. Trees do have much deeper root depths. And then you want to start building these complex integrated systems. You can see the trees have grown here. You're still planting perhaps broccoli, lettuce, or something that's biennial, or adding a nitrogen fixer also. You might be adding other plants that have more mycorrhiza too and can help trap phosphorus. So these are more complex systems. And finally, you do eventually with trees reach a tree crop system. So what do you want to do with a tree crop system? Do you want to keep it permanently in the system, or do you want to be able to add some annual or biennial crops back to it? So let's think about, we've developed a successionally developed system. How do we manage it? Do we keep it in trees? This is an example of an orchard in a temperate area. Do we cut it down and start over? Or think about introducing disturbance in a managed way. And what this is using the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, using that in agriculture, that you can introduce disturbance, and as long as it's not too intense, frequent, or widespread, we should be able to maintain structure and function of the ecosystem. So it may be that we cut down some of the trees so we can add back some annual crops, and what we end up having is a successional mosaic, and this is basically diversity of disturbance. So this is a way that we can manage our systems and still keep some of the high net primary productivity. There are other examples of successionally and ecologically developed agroecosystems. We've talked about trees, but perennials do play an important part. It is useful to think about perennial crops. We've mentioned blueberries, for example, but what about grains? Cassava in the tropics, that one is not an annual crop, that lasts for several years, but we do need to explore much more something like a perennial wheatgrass crop. If we compare what perennial wheatgrasses, native wheatgrasses look like, they have a much more developed root system than our annual winter wheats. So this is a bit of a plant breeding issue, that we need to learn how to do something like this. Animals are another example of how to introduce not just diversity, but more developed agroecosystems. Rice paddies in the tropics are temperate areas that might be adding fish, adding ducks. These are some examples. If we use these types of systems, we will see, just as in nature, we'll see the net primary productivity increase as the biomass after a disturbance also increases. This axis shows you biomass in tons per hectare, and then this axis shows you the net primary productivity, which goes down as biomass increases. Keep in mind, the reason that it goes down over time is the biomass needs a lot of the carbon that's been fixed for respiration because it has to maintain that. So following these natural systems in our agroecosystems allows us to be both productive and fertile. And I'm going to back up. This helps us see productivity, the net primary productivity of edible biomass, and then biomass here, that is more for the soil, for future fertility. So doing this allows us to reduce external inputs and maintain our resources instead of degrading them, and allows for a more resilient agroecosystem that's resilient to changes and damage. We've looked at using trees, and the chapter in your book talks a lot about agroforestry, and we had great presentations by Group 7 on agroforestry. Trees do play an important role because they have, they're permanent in the system. You know, they not only increase solar capture, they increase nutrient cycle with their deep roots, but they also provide more permanent habitat for microsites, for habitat for beneficial organisms. They intercept solar radiation, rain, and wind. So they provide many benefits above ground. They provide shade, which may be useful for animals, not as useful for crops. You can see in this image the corn does better a bit away from the tree, like if it's being alley cropped. It does add more organic matter, it sheds leaves, so there are many advantages above ground and below ground of incorporating trees. This is an example in the tropics of a living fence that was started with stakes from a nitrogen-fixing tree jammed into the ground. They started growing. That's a living fence. This is an example of a protein bank, and mulberry is commonly grown for silkworms, but mulberry is a tree species. Morus alba is the species that's typically used, and it can also provide good protein to animals. So a protein bank is useful in the tropics, for example, where areas have been overgrazed. The protein bank can add more forage for livestock grazing. And here's an example of a nurse tree. This is one that's often used in coffee plantations. This is Erythrina poipiana is this type of tree. But you can see you can do a boundary planting like a living fence. You can plant trees in many different designs. You can use a shelter belt if you have a lot of wind, and these would be thicker, wider plantings of trees, or in thinner strips you can do alley cropping. Trees in fields, it may be an orchard or plantation, or it may be that you have trees in the pasture and they provide shade for livestock. Or here's an example of a concentrated protein bank of trees for livestock grazing. So many of these common agroforestry systems, here's an example of alley cropping, that you have, your strips, lines of trees, and then you plant your crops in between. Your tomatoes are going to need a lot more light, so it's good to put them away from the taller trees. Alley cropping, shelter belts, which can also provide a windbreak. Silvopastoral, putting trees or keeping trees in pasture. A living fence that's often made with stakes. Nurse trees, like are used in coffee plantations, and these are often nitrogen fixers. Protein bank for fodder, or it may be, as we've said, more of an orchard that we're familiar with for wood or for nuts or fruit. I want to point out a book that was written in the 30s, and this is by J. Russell Smith. It's called Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture. And it was written a long time ago, but it was very forward-thinking. and has many applications for today that we can actually get our nutrients from tree crops. We need, as you know, protein and fat, and that's available in many of our nuts. Pecans and walnuts are high protein, also high fat, but we also do need our carbohydrates, and we can get those in the form of simple sugars from many of our fruits, apples and pears, or complex carbohydrates, which is more like corn or wheat. And these are our chestnuts that we used to have in the U.S. and we're trying to reinstate. Blight-resistant chestnuts, or oak acorns are another example that indigenous people ate many acorns. Tropical home gardens are an example of extremely diverse and successionally developed systems. I showed you an image of some work I've done in Mexico with our diversity PowerPoint last week. And here's an example of a diagram of what many of these very diverse home gardens look like. It may be that there's trees, it might be some type of guanabana, water apple type species, it may be coconut, mango, guava, banana, or it could also be lower growing cardamom, taro, papaya. These are many different tropical systems. I had a friend in grad school from Jamaica, and she said her mom just never worried about her having anything to eat after school because they had breadfruit, they had all kinds of things in their home garden outside her house. So these are examples of the tropics, but keep in mind in temperate zones too, permaculture is an example of human design systems. That permaculture was developed in Australia. And you know, you might look at the residence for humans and plan some of your highly used areas like your herb gardens and your vegetable gardens close to the residence, and it may be that further away this is a lower intensity use where you might keep grazing livestock and more of your structural forest or food forest. Some of your nuts and fruit systems might be a little bit closer to the house. You know, some animals do need a lot of care. So chickens, for example, would be closer to the house. So these are great examples. It doesn't have to be the tropics. There are many wonderful examples of successionally developed agroecosystems in temperate areas also. This is the end of our discussion.